Welcome to today's episode of the Unveil Podcast, where I have the privilege of interviewing Aurianna Joy. Aurianna is a somatic leadership coach, embodiment mentor, herbalist, doula, and trauma resolution educator who guides individuals on the delicate path of cultivating aliveness and living a life free from trauma. Using her 15 years of personal inner work and spiritual growth, combined with 10 years of professional experience in the healing arts, she weaves an intricate web of healing and remembering for those in devotion to their path of becoming. She's also, as you will hear, an amazing human. And no, that's not in her official bio, though maybe it should be. That is my personal opinion. I have had the privilege of working with Aurianna for the last few months within the Trauma and Somatics course, and we talk about that a little bit on today's episode. We talk about somatics and the realm of somatics and being somatically oriented as a practitioner or just as a human being. We discuss plant medicines, their benefits, their potential pitfalls, and the modern landscape around these medicines. We then segue into a discussion of humaning, the experience of emotions, the experience of difficult emotions such as sorrow and grief and fear. This is a conversation about turning towards and being with all the things that make up the human experience. And as you will hear, there is no better person to take us through this conversation. Aurianna has such a down-to-earth personality and yet has such a connection to the mystical and to the earthly, to the energy from which we come and to which we return. I really hope you enjoy this episode, and all of the resources mentioned during this conversation can be found in today's show notes. So, welcome to the Unveil Podcast, Aurianna Joy.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Victoria.
Oh, I'm so excited for this. And there will be context for long-term listeners, and we will get into all the weeds. But I also wanted to just celebrate you because yesterday I was part of the Trauma and Somatics cohort that graduated as a trauma-informed professional, which feels very good. And you are responsible for the Trauma and Somatics training, which got me to that point.
Well, thank you. And congratulations.
Thank you.
What a feat.
Yeah, well, an amazing training, unspeakably amazing training that you and your business partner, Will Rezin, who our listeners will know, put together and lead people through. So I wanted to start there. I wanted you to just sort of take me into the world of trauma and somatics. Where did it come from? What is it to you? What is the experience? And what is the purpose of the training?
Yeah, absolutely. So Will, my current business partner and co-facilitator of the training, and I were life partners for 5 years. And we met in an ayahuasca ceremony in 2016. And we had both spent a significant chunk of time in Peru and studying Amazonian shamanism, working with plant spirit medicine. And we instantly connected on that front and many other layers. We both had a coaching background. We both studied astrology. We were both really in love with studying the human experience. And from there, we were together for 5 years. And during that time, we both went through the somatic experiencing training, which is a training created by the work of Peter Levine. And so I won't go super into detail about that, but it's worth looking into if anyone is interested to learn more, although Will might have talked about that on the other podcast recently.
Not overly, actually, but my listeners will soon find out about it because I'm about to start the somatic experience.
Congratulations.
Training, so, yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So we went through it together and it was radically life-changing. I remember after the first module, we both looked at each other and we were like, why doesn't everyone know this? We feel like this is the handbook of how to be a functional human, which is really oriented around our physiology and literally how we function as an organism. And as we went through that 3-year training, more and more layers, it was like Pandora's box just opened of insights, ahas, things we had been studying previously all started to connect through the world of somatics. And both of us having a trauma history, we watched significant healing happen individually and in our coupleship. And we became really, really passionate about teaching somatics and being somatic oriented and living in a somatic reality. And because we both had a coaching background, we started to have conversations about the coaching industry and some of the gaps in awareness. And, there's this concept in NLP, neurolinguistic programming, what you don't know what you don't know. And we realized that that was us before we got our somatic training. And with the somatic awareness that we now had and the trauma-informed lens, we were looking at the coaching industry and cringing. We were like, holy shit, there are just so many people causing harm and they don't even know it. They have great intentions. They're good-hearted people. They care. There's no malintent. They just don't know what they don't know. And so Will actually was the visionary for Trauma and Somatics. And eventually we decided to create the training to bridge that gap. Initially for the coaching industry. And then we realized that more and more people were being drawn to the training. So in the 2 years that we've run the training, we've had doctors, nurses, doulas, massage therapists, licensed professional counselors, parents. We've had all kinds of people come through the training to learn how to be a trauma-informed human. So we orient the training for helping professionals, but really this material is relevant for anyone in a body and anyone who interacts with anyone in a body, which is all of us.
Everyone. No, and I second that wholeheartedly. I believe everyone should do this training. Just full stop.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah. And initially we didn't really know what the response was going to be. We had a vision. We knew things that we wanted to teach. We wanted to people to be aware of. And the training has kind of taken on a life of its own. It's just continued to grow. We've refined it every time. We've added things in. We've taken things out. We've deepened at this point. So the way the course works, as you'll know, Victoria, is that there's self-study modules, which are more focused on the trauma-informed aspect of trauma and somatics. So how to be a trauma-sensitive human and how to offer trauma-sensitive care, no matter what kind of service you offer. And then the live classes are more oriented towards the somatic lens, which essentially, for those who don't know, somatics is really about learning to relate with reality as it is by being deeply in contact with our felt sense, with what's happening inside of us, our sensations, our emotions, the deepening of our experience, right? Because it's all happening. It's always happening. It's just, are we conscious of it? Are we in contact with it? So somatics really invites us deeper into the reality of our lived experience. And in that way, what we've found, a lot of the feedback we've gotten from students is, holy shit, I understand myself so much better. I have so much more compassion for people and everything is different now because we're actually being with ourselves as we are instead of kind of living outside of our body, hovering in our headspace, being really heady, really mind-oriented, logical, reasoning, rationale, linear focused. And we really deepen into the multidimensionality of what it is to be human, which includes, yes, our mind and the mental realm, but also emotions, the experience of our body, sensations, impulses, the relational field, the spiritual aspect, and that word might not resonate for some people, but there is a something that harmonizes humans and we can feel it when we are in relationship, in right relationship with life. It feels like a dance. And when we are out of right relationship with life, it feels like someone's stepping on our toes or we're stepping on someone's toes in the dance of life. Right. Yeah. And so when I say the spiritual, that's what I mean. Like whatever people want to fill in the blank of that, just the general relationship with life, with the unseen aspects of reality. And so somatics takes into account all of these parts of what it is to be human.
It's a beautiful explanation. And just to give people a little bit more context, this is a 3-month course. It's 12 weeks. I'm right in saying that, aren't I? It's 3 months.
Yep, yeah, correct.
And to feel the difference after 3 months and actually to be part of the closing of the container yesterday with the session and just hearing people's experience, feedback, not really, oh, my career has totally changed because of X, but I've totally changed. I feel like I'm living in my world, in myself, in my being completely differently, myself included. And the whole training has been a great inspiration to me that even with my history, and we're going to get into yours in a second, but even with my history of having an unsafe vehicle, an unsafe body, being with the wholeness of myself isn't actually that terrible. It's not that uncomfortable. It's like, it's not, the world didn't end like in the last 3 months, like as far as I can tell. So, and it's so wonderful to listen to my version of that, but also all of the other students. And I said it in our little breakout session yesterday, I feel really connected to this group of people, even though I haven't fully interacted loads and loads. I think it's just the nature of this kind of deepening of an intimacy with oneself. You almost deepen your intimacy with the potential to connect with everyone else that you're just humaning with.
Absolutely. And with all of life, really, deepening intimacy with the entirety of our existence. And I often hear from clients and women that I teach and students that I teach that, life just feels better, like just contacting reality in a new way. And the seasons make more sense instead of hating winter and loving summer, whether literally or metaphorically, right? In our inner experience, there's more just openness to all of it. And we get to interact with life in an entirely new way, including our relationships with other people, because we're here. Like, we're actually here. We're not dislocated in time and space, living in the past from our traumas, living in the future, worrying about stressors. We call somatics an embodied mindfulness practice, an embodied presence practice, because it really brings us into the now. And there's so much more possible when we're fully here versus living in some other experience.
Absolutely. Oh, amen to that. And I know that none of us, I don't think anybody just started here in somatic land. I mean, I believe everybody should. Like, we want to change the world so that everyone knows this from almost birth. But how did you get here? You mentioned earlier, this made a lot of sense of what you already studied and, your past traumas. Tell us your story and fill us in with your kind of extensive background before you met the world of somatics.
Yeah. So, I mean, really my journey, and I didn't quite know this at the time, it wasn't until my early mid-20s that the dots really started to connect. But in hindsight, I could see the journey really started at birth, or really in the womb for me. So I was shown in an ayahuasca ceremony, and something that I had always intuited and had this kind of sense of, but never had the exact understanding of what happened, was that I was conceived with a twin, and that my twin died in utero very early on. And I've checked in with my mother about this. The story lines up. She thought she was having a miscarriage. She goes to the doctor, finds out that my heartbeat is still there. And so really my feeling of disconnect from the world started in utero. And then there were early developmental dynamics, things that happened in my first few years of life that made it hard to incarnate. It's like I never fully landed in my body, and that manifested as random things. I was always kind of a sickly child, earaches and really intense leg cramps, and just like, I can remember I hated recess. I'm like what kid hates recess? I'm like, I don't want to be in my body. I just want to read a book. Like, I don't want to be out there in the physical. I hated PE class, things like that. So being in my body was really hard from the get-go. And then when I was 13, I went through a traumatic abusive experience, which really made it even harder. So right around the time of puberty, when my biochemistry is moving me towards an even fuller expression of myself, there was this trauma that really inhibited my development in a lot of ways. And then that started to manifest as irritable bowel syndrome, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, migraines. I went to doctors from the time I was about 13, 14. I would go to doctors and, trying to figure out what was wrong. My parents were completely in the Western medical paradigm. They didn't know anything different. And so they would just bring me to Western medical doctors, and kind of depending on who we were seeing, I would get a different diagnosis, but nothing was ever really clear. It was like, maybe you have lupus, maybe you have MS, maybe you've got juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, like maybe, but no one could really tell me what it was or what to do. From there, I got put on pain medication. I was put on hydrocodone when I was 14 and got addicted to pain pills. Yep. And so there's a lot of details I could fill in here, but that kind of illustrates it, right? I was just very disembodied, very much in a deep freeze state, chronic pain, ended up dropping out of high school because of all of it. I just couldn't keep up with life, essentially. And then when there was this kind of series of synchronicities, when I was 15, my mom sent me to a Tony Robbins event. For those who are not familiar with Tony Robbins, he is kind of the godfather of personal development, if you will. OG. Yeah. Been around since the 70s, 80s, putting on, tens of thousands of people in a seminar. Right. It's not my cup of tea at this point, but at that time, it really brought some awareness for me to my patterns of disorganization. And I would attend these events for many years, but it didn't really quite sink in until I was 19. And then really about the time I was 21, I really started to take the reins of my life and decided that, backtrack. So when I was 16, I got diagnosed with chronic Lyme disease, which was the first time that the dots really connected. And even for my 16-year-old self, I was like, yeah, that one landed. It just, something landed in a different way than the other ones. And I was told essentially at that time that they didn't know how far it was going to progress. They didn't know how fast it was going to come on. I could just live with aches and pains, or I could be in a wheelchair. And the doctor basically told me at 18 years old, enjoy your life while you can. We're going to help you with vitamins and minerals and things like that, but we don't know. And I took that on as truth for a while until a series of synchronicities occurred that around 21, I just kind of woke up and I was like, that's not okay. I don't know what, but not that. Right. And that's where it really, really started for me. So I dropped out of college, enrolled in a health coach training program, immersed myself even more in personal development work, attended or volunteered at Tony Robbins events like 3 times a year, and really went all in on myself. I started doing a ton of research. I read When the Body Says No by Gabor Mate in 2012. And I had a biology background. When I was in college, I was studying to be pre-med. And all these dots just kind of connected in my early 20s, which then led me to living and working in the jungles of Peru, working with ayahuasca, studying Amazonian shamanism. And I just kept opening my world, to say the least. If anyone listening has drank ayahuasca, you know that it just reveals layers upon layers of reality that we don't normally perceive. So from there, I really went all in on my coaching business and started coaching people full time I was 24 at that time. And yeah, I just kept studying and learning and practicing and applying to myself. I used myself as a guinea pig for everything that I was learning, which eventually led me to somatics when I was 27. So it was about 5 years ago. And here we are. And somatics was it was, like I said, the thread that just wove all of it together. I had this holistic healing paradigm understanding. I understood that you can't separate the parts from the whole, that everything is interconnected, that we are a body and a mind and a spirit. I understood all of that. And somatics just dropped it in this new way that I think for a lot of people, and this is the feedback we get from students a lot too, is that there is this felt sense understanding of we are more than just a body, but the experience of it we aren't really in contact with the experience of it. It's more of a concept and an intuition. And then somatics really brings us to that experiential understanding of our depth and multidimensionality.
And to echo that final part that you said, that's exactly what I'm finding. People who listen to this podcast will know my extensive kind of medical history and the personal and then professional. And what I am finding as I step into really deeply into the world of somatics is there is languaging structure around something that I kind of had to figure out and guess at and intuit and like kind of got it and have been giving it to people. And now there is a language and a a much more delicate formation of treatment around, and using that word lightly, but treatment and care and how to care within that realm that has understanding and layers of depth to it. And that is very much the experience I'm having as I meet it. And yeah, so just to echo that. And also, anyone who knows my history, which will be quite a few of our listeners, will understand that moment of no, like not that, but like, I don't know what, just no, because I had a very similar thing. And it's interesting because I have we then went in very different directions. I have never been in the kind of jungles doing ayahuasca, but that inner fire, I think it never really goes out if you're supposed to do the kind of healing professional things. And that sense of just something turning on, I really resonate when you shared that, because I remember the moment. I remember my moment. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an alchemical process, that fire that kind of lights a fire under our ass, so to speak, like gets us moving, gets us, relating with life in a different way. And it's unfortunate, right, that a lot of us have to kind of come to this place, but it's also from a meta out perspective, it's pretty incredible that I find it incredible that life like organizes us in such a way to pull us forward on our path of evolution.
Always. And I find it so remarkable how similar the stories are for people who've gone through these kind of heroes' journeys, or whatever we want to call them. They're very archetypal in nature. I think there's very visceral and primitive things that are being kind of hashed out. But for people like yourself and myself, through our bodies, through our actual lived experience, and then to find something like somatics that helps that become a more integrated experience makes a lot of sense to someone like me. So with the ayahuasca history and all that craziness, how do you relate to that time now? Because that's a deeply kind of consciousness escaping or going into a separate, you tell us about it, because I've never done it, but like, how do you relate to that now, given this kind of like embodied somatic thing, which feels very of this world? How do you relate to the ayahuasca history, your ayahuasca history anyway?
Yeah, my ayahuasca history, I mean, I'm eternally grateful. So grateful that my path wove the way it did, not just to work with ayahuasca, but to live off grid for such an extended period of time. I lived in the jungle over the course of a year and a half, or about 2 years, really. I lived in the jungle for 10 months. So 6 months the first time, and then 4 months the second time, 4.5 months the second time. And it was essential. It was an essential part of my path to understand that I am of nature, that I'm not separate from. I think a lot of modern humans, it's really easy to just hover above the body that holds us, right? The earth is the container that really holds the human experience. Like we couldn't be here without the earth, right? And all of her resources and offerings. And so to live in such close contact with the earth, with no running water, no electricity, no walls. I mean, we had mosquito nets for walls kind of thing. It was incredible. And then to drink ayahuasca multiple times a week, to work with other plant spirits, really just opened up this understanding that there's more here than what we understand normally. The average human, at least the world that I grew up in, had no context for any of this, and let alone prioritizing it. And so when Will and I first met, he was sharing about somatic experiencing with me, and one of the first things out of my mouth was, "Oh, it's the science of shamanism. Like it's everything that I've been experiencing." And coming to understand, because a lot of my work with ayahuasca was working with my body, moving things, traveling deep inside of myself, unwinding, reconnecting. And that's what somatics and somatic experiencing specifically, what it does. Somatic experiencing is really deeply rooted in shamanism. It's just taught through a Western lens, and mysticism and science are starting to understand that we're really just talking about the same thing, just using different language, but we're all pointing to the same thing, which is the truth of reality, right? And so at this point, I am so grateful for my journey with ayahuasca, and I am not currently partaking in psychedelic work. It's been about 4 years. This fall will be 4 years since I've drank ayahuasca. And I don't do psychedelics very often at all at this point. For context, there was about a 3-year period where I did about 95 ayahuasca ceremonies and was journeying with mushrooms regularly, worked with Wachuma or San Pedro, did some MDMA. I was really deeply exploring the psychedelic realms. And then at some point that impulse slowed down. And I think it was because of somatics and because ayahuasca, when I left the jungle both times, the feedback that I got when I would come to ceremony and I knew I was leaving, I knew I was coming back to the States, and I would say, like, well, what am I supposed to do? And the medicine would say, go be human. Like, go be human and go teach them what you've learned. Like, go bring this into your life, and people will listen when they're ready. People will turn towards you and ask for guidance. And that was very much how my path unfolded, and why we're here ultimately.
I adore you sharing that side of this, because it's so common at this moment in time to hear this ayahuasca or any plant medicine is kind of a much more a consciousness mental thing. But to hear you describe the kind of physiological unlocking that you were doing with the support and help of not just the medicine, but also the tradition, the experience in the environment, it feels like when you speak about it, I get the sense that it was a whole experiential just chapter of life, not the one-off experiences that you were kind of drinking the medicine.
Very much so. Very much so. And that leads me to the next point, which is kind of my opinion on plant medicines at this point in time. So when I started working with ayahuasca back in 2013, it was not as popular in the Western world as it is nowadays. I think at the time there was like a documentary, a National Geographic article, and then a couple people talking about their experiences on YouTube. There wasn't really much. And I happened to have a couple friends who ultimately pointed me in that direction. And not to say that it wasn't happening, but it was not. I mean, it's everywhere now, right?
Yes.
And I have some thoughts from multiple perspectives on that, one being the somatic lens, and then one being the having studied with indigenous wisdom keepers lens. And so the somatic lens, I'll start with that, is that I think most people are not ready for plant medicines physiologically, which includes mental and emotional, because we say in somatics that our story emerges from state, which means the mindset, the narrative, the mental experience that we're having, the thoughts are emergent from what's happening in our body. So if our body is stressed, and most people can understand this, imagine a time when you were stressed and remember the thoughts you were having. They were probably pretty racy, pretty staccato, right? They were maybe sharper, maybe more confused, maybe more graspy, right? And that's because the body was stressed. Whereas when we're in a peaceful state, imagining yourself on a beach or in your favorite place, wherever that might be, right? The weather of our mind is clearer, softer, less forceful, at least, right? And so I think that being said, a lot of people who are turning towards psychedelics, they really need a different kind of support initially. Not to say that they won't benefit from psychedelics ever, but I've seen, and it's not talked about as commonly, unfortunately, because there's a lot of shame and a lot of stigma and what's wrong with me because this happened. But a lot of people are having experiences that leave them more fragmented than when they went in. And it's a shame. It's sad, because people are coming to these medicines wanting support, wanting guidance, wanting to feel more integrated in their being. They're trusting their facilitators. They're opening up every part of themselves. The most vulnerable experience one can do is to take a psychedelic, because you don't know where you're going to go. You don't know how deep it's going to take you. And without the right structures built internally, physiologically, mentally, emotionally, it can leave people further from the healing that they seek. So I think for the right people at the right time, plant medicines are incredible. For other people, they can do more harm than good. And then on the other side,
I'm just going to interrupt you there, because I really appreciate you saying that, because when people say, like, people know me and they know what I do, and they're like, why haven't you taken it? You've just explained why I haven't done any of this, because instinctively it has never called to me. And I remember the very first thing I ever heard about something like ayahuasca, it's like, it will call to you if you're supposed to be doing it. And I truly believe in I don't know whether I personify it in the way that people do, but I do believe that the energies are always in the ether, and things like spark our attention, catch our gaze. And it's very easy with the proliferation of the narrative about ayahuasca to think it's catching your gaze. It's not. It's just literally everywhere right now. And there's so much that you can't avoid it, certainly if you're in this world. But that instability, that inherent, I'm not safe in my own body yet sense that I've had has been exactly why I haven't wanted to go and further experiment with anything that destabilizes an already unstable system. So just to 100% honor and echo what you've just said. I think that's a beautiful reflection from somebody who's got more experience, because everyone dismisses what I say because it's like, you never tried it, you have no idea. And it's like, okay. But to hear a seasoned professional explain a very, very lucid explanation of why this is not necessarily the best thing for everyone all the time is very supportive. But do please go on to your kind of second thought process around the plant medicines.
Yeah, well, thank you for jumping in there, because it really does point to, the power of somatics. I mean, you're working with a somatic practitioner when it's deep, it's depth work. And what somatics offers is this ability to titrate the experience so we can turn it off. We can pull away. Coming back to somatics is the science of shamanism. We've mapped, somatic experts, somatic practitioners have mapped the experience, the interior of someone's experience in such a way that if it becomes too much, we slow down, we stop, we pivot our attention, which actually kind of counterintuitively, a lot of people in the plant medicine world think, go deeper, go deeper, go deeper. When I was in the plant medicine world, the narrative was, oh, you're feeling challenged? Go drink more medicine. You need a bigger cup tonight. You need to drink more frequently. You need to go deeper. You need to trust the medicine. But this idea of just trust the process isn't trauma informed. Because there's a reason why people don't trust. There's a reason why people don't feel safe. There's a reason why the system feels unstable. And we want to honor that. Not to say that we want to just stay there forever. I think some people can get that confused. Like, well, eventually you have to grow. Yes. And there's a difference between growing through what we call the safety zone versus the danger zone. The danger zone being you are over the threshold of your window of tolerance. Your physiology is in fight or flight or freeze. And it's saying, this is too much. I can't handle this. And oftentimes people are already in that state when they're coming to plant medicines. And so I just want to commend you for being so attuned to your experience and honoring yourself, because yes, you're right that a lot of people, because it just is so in your face and everyone's getting invitations and people think, oh, because I'm being invited to this ceremony on a Friday night in a, apartment in New York City, like that means I'm being called. It's like, no. There's a lot more. And that's where like the art of listening is really, really important. And that's something that we learn working with indigenous wisdom keepers, the shamans in Peru, the curanderos that I worked with. They helped me, and my facilitators helped me to learn discernment. Just because this is common too in the ayahuasca world, where things will appear in a vision and people take it as ultimate truth because this plant medicine showed it to them. And it's like, no. Like, you have to understand these medicines work symbolically. They work in the same way, kind of like dreams do. It's archetypal. It's not linear. And so when people are really fixated in the linear model of being, they can actually create greater fragmentation, because if the medicine told me so, they're going to jump on that and they're going to just do the thing without actually feeling and reading the room, so to speak, and like sensing into how that plays out in their real life. So it does break my heart, in full transparency, to watch the way that ayahuasca is being used in the modern world these days. I feel really, really blessed to have been able to study in Peru, work with indigenous elders, live on the land where ayahuasca was grown and brewed. I've brewed ayahuasca. I've sang the medicine songs. It's a completely different experience than just dropping into a ceremony on a Friday and Saturday night and then going back to your world. Now, I'm not going to say that there isn't, in Peru, one of my teachers, one of my maestros said, the plants want to reach the world. Like, the world needs this right now, and like, go take this back to your country. And so I'm not going to say that there isn't that part of the equation, because I do think there is this way that ayahuasca and machuma and mushrooms are kind of reaching out, I think, to help us, to help us come back to our true nature and remember the essence of who we are. I just think it's being done in a Western way. And we don't have to look very far to see that the Western way is not sustainable. It's not ecological. It's not inclusive, and it's not trauma informed. And so many people are finding themselves in ayahuasca ceremonies ill prepared. They don't have the right support for integration. And then they feel further from themselves than when they started.
And it's so true. I mean, I have so many examples, I'm sure you do, of people who either have come from a ceremony and, you know, said, oh, I'm supposed to be with that person, start that business. And they've tried, and then like everything goes wrong. And then they feel like a failure. They feel like they've let a plant down. The amount of things I've heard. I mean, and I feel that there's such a wisdom inherent in this world. And I think it's being missed when we're trying to kind of gamify it almost. Like it's a trip. It's not an experience of coming into contact with oneself. It's like getting out of oneself more so. Yeah. And it's interesting to hear that your kind of take on that dualistic, I know these medicines need to want to be here. I'm totally on your page. I believe there is kind of this, something's happening in the world at the moment. I think personally, there is a massive super spinning evolution, and this is part of it. But there's always the kind of crazy Catherine wheel of like sparks that have to happen to get us to the point of balance and settledness. Is what I see. I'd be interested in your take on your kind of view on things and the last few years that we've all been through with the dreaded virus and all that kind of stuff. I'd love to just hear you speak on that for a minute, if you have anything particularly salient to say.
Yeah, I do. And it comes from my ayahuasca journeys. So I had a journey. I don't know that I've ever actually spoken about this publicly so much. Most people in my close world know about it, but it feels right to share it here, that I had a journey back in 2014 where I essentially asked the medicine, show me why I incarnated, which I just want to say, be careful what you wish for.
I was going to say, that sounds like the worst idea in the world, but yeah.
It sounded great at the time. I'm like, I want to know my purpose. But I framed it as, show me why I incarnated. Like, why did my soul choose to come into physical form and have this human experience? And I was blasted for, I mean, I don't know how long, because in the psychedelic space, time is warped and winding, but it felt like eternity at the time, where I was experiencing isn't even exactly quite the right word, but in lieu of something more definitive, I was experiencing all of the pain of humanity, essentially. And I was both the abuser, the one being abused, and the fly on the wall with the 30,000 foot view meta perspective of it. And abuser being, I mean, rape, war, torture, destroying the earth, all of it. I was just, it was so overwhelming that I didn't know how to be with it. And I remember in the experience, the part of me that was still me, that knew that I was in an ayahuasca journey, I remember internally screaming, make it stop, make it stop, make it stop. And it did when I asked it to stop eventually. And then from there, I floated up beyond the earth. And I was looking down at this little blue marble. And my primary guide was with me. And I was like, what the fuck was that? And they were like, well, you wanted to know why you incarnated. This is it. You came to help. And I was like, damn, like, that's a lot. Am I going to have to do, like, what can I do? You know, I was like 24 years old at the time, right? I'm like, what can I possibly do that could help all of the ways that humans harm themselves and each other and the earth? And from there, I was popped up into a realm beyond time and space. Aurianna, no longer existed. Nothing that I currently know, that we know and relate with, existed. It's hard to put into words because it's just so amorphous, so beyond. But suffice it to say, I was witnessing the battle of light and dark. It was almost like Star Wars, or kind of like Harry Potter-esque, right? Like just that archetypal what has always been, what will always be, battle of light and dark. Dark being that which has forgotten its own divinity. And that was, the journey continued on about ways that I can bring light and truth to my life, to the world. And to come back to your question about what's been going on in the last few years. So that journey happened in 2014. So for about 6 years, I was just waiting. I was waiting for something to happen. And I had a number of ayahuasca journeys after that kind of pointed to like something big is going to happen in your life. And you decided to be here for it. And all of you decided to be here for it. And I remember this one journey, I asked the medicine, like, how do I help? Like, please tell me in very human terms, what do I do to help? And the medicine said, many people are going to die. And you have to hold the line, essentially. Like, you know that that's all a part of it. It's all a part of what the cosmic order of things. And I was heartbroken. I was like, that doesn't feel okay for me. Right. And so that journey was in 2015. So for 5 years, in many ways, I didn't really talk about it very often. I didn't necessarily like do direct work on it, but it was just in my consciousness that something was going to happen in my lifetime. And so when COVID hit, it wasn't a shock for me. I mean, it was in my own way, but also there was this sense of like, here we are. This is it. This is the thing. We've been waiting for this. And everything that I'd learned through my journey work and through the 5-6 years of waiting and processing and fear and all of that came into play. And really that was one of the biggest teachings for me. And it actually started very early on in my ayahuasca work, where my shaman told me, you have to learn, this is very Amazonian shamanism perspective, but he said, you have to learn how to dominate fear. And I think that's a lot of what humanity is being invited into right now. I hold the paradigm, kind of one of my primary pillars of life that helps me get through the craziness of the human experience, is that everything is an invitation. When we turn the diamond and we look at it, the different facets of it, right? We can see the lens of pain, of loss, which needs to be honored in its own right. We need to know how to grieve properly. We really benefit from that. And also the death cycles, right on the other side is a rebirth. Eventually we come up out of the underworld and we emerge anew. And so everything that I've experienced in the last decade or so, the more that I orient towards it as an invitation, the more I see the opportunities for growth and healing and evolution. And so I think right now, a large part of what humanity is being invited into is to honor the fear. And this is where somatics is really great, because it teaches us how to navigate our own stress responses. And remember to keep pointing towards what's possible. I think a lot of times people get, myself included, right? This has been my own initiatory process, is to not let the fear win and to keep staying in the realms of innovation, right? You know, the gene keys, my third gene key, chaos and innovation, right? And a return to innocence, that divine play, right? Remembering that we're here to create and explore and love. And so I think in many ways, humanity is being invited into that. And I have more that I could say on the subject, but I'll leave it there for now.
And I so appreciate all of that. And the gene keys was in my head as you were speaking, actually. And though I haven't done any of the kind of consciousness exploration from a plant medicine perspective, that was my consciousness exploration. And so when we talk about these archetypal battles within the gene keys, we do map those archetypal wounding patterns, the big sequences, the rapist and the victim, the abuser abused, all those kinds of things. And that duality of pain inflicted and pain being received, and all of it coming from this like loss of sense of divinity, makes total sense to me. And I think that everyone has been looking for a way to think about this kind of chaos that we're kind of seeing everywhere. And that sense of invitation to come more into contact with reality, essentially, and what you're feeling, and also the potential of possibilities, is a wonderful way to kind of conceive all of this. And just to honor the fact that there has been a lot of death, I would love, because I know it's something that you're interested in, I would love you to just share with our listeners some tips is the worst word, but some kind of like tools around the grieving process, because we're terrible at grief, I believe, in the modern society. And for anyone who doesn't want to jive with the invitation because there's a big grief pattern, what would you maybe suggest to someone like that?
Yeah, I love that you brought the conversation this way, because we can't bypass, right? I can sit here now because of the work I've done around grief and writing my own relationship with death. And so I'll kind of share a little story, and then I'll answer directly the tips or tricks or techniques question. So when COVID hit, just about 2 weeks before the world went into lockdown, Will and I found out we were living in a house filled with toxic mold. And having a history of chronic Lyme disease and understanding what mold does to the human organism, especially people who are more immunocompromised, I knew it was not a good thing. And to say
that's
the
a
least.
literal understatement for listeners. That's like, this is possibly the worst news ever.
Very, very bad. Yeah, no, it really was. And there was this part of me that was just like, the witness, the observer of it all, that was like, of fucking course, my personal hell would come into being as the world is just going through utter chaos.
Yeah.
And again, because of my experiences, I was able to hold it as like, this is the teaching, this is a lesson, like hold the line, keep facing forward, keep turning towards the hard shit. So what ended up happening is Will and I lived in that house for a year, and we both got very, very sick. And it's been 2.5 years since, and I'm still in the process of healing from mold toxicity. And I won't go into all of those details. That could be a whole podcast in and of itself.
Right. Yeah.
But suffice it to say, I was deep in the underworld. While the world was in chaos, I was in my own personal version of hell, where I was in a house that was making me sick and I couldn't get out of it. And so what that led me to was this really, really deep initiation with grief, or as Francis Weller, he's an incredible grief writer, he calls it an apprenticeship with sorrow. And I turned towards it and I said, teach me, show me, like, what am I supposed to learn here? And I went all the way to the places of, I might die. Like this might be the one that gets me. I might not have the resources, the strength to get through this. Because there were days where I literally couldn't lift my head off the pillow and was just in excruciating pain. And so I asked myself the question, I don't know how this came through exactly, but at some point, deep in the realms of pain and grief and fear, I asked myself, if I were to die, how would I want to look back on my life? And what would be the last thought I want to have before I leave my body? And the answer came through so clear. It's thank you. I just want to be able to feel gratitude as I leave my body.
Wow.
And that led me to a whole journey of really studying death, where I eventually trained to become a death doula. Last summer, I trained with the Death Wives, Erin and Lauren. They're incredible. If anyone is interested in a death doula training, either to become a death doula or to just write your relationship with death, they're incredible mentors for that. And what I would say is turn towards it. Turn towards it. And that doesn't mean turn all the way and overwhelm yourself with it, but read some books on grief and sorrow. Do some grief counseling. Right? Do some work around what lives inside of you, because it lives inside of all of us. And there's a lot of unattended sorrow that lives inside of us, a lot of grief that we haven't processed. We tend to, in our culture, kind of relegate grief to the realms of you lost a loved one, or you had some tragic accident where your body is no longer the same, or a diagnosis. Like those are the appropriate places to grieve, but only for a certain period of time. There's actually a new diagnosis in the DSM. I don't know if you know this. I think it's something like prolonged grief syndrome.
Oh, lordy me. Okay. Wow.
Yeah. They've literally termed how long you can grieve before it's a pathology, which is insanity.
Oh my God. The manual of like insanities is insane in and of itself. Honestly, that's just ridiculous.
Right. And it points to it points to the pathology of our culture, right? I tend not to be someone who pathologizes. I tend to try to stay away from that. But this really does point to the sickness of our culture to think that grief should be time bound. And that if it's not, there's something wrong with you and you need something. I mean, yes, we do need something. We need space to grieve. Like grief can only be processed with the appropriate time, space, and support. So I encourage people to, find resources, whether that be meditations. Tibetan Buddhism is really incredible for pointing us towards righting our relationship with death. In Tibetan Buddhism, it's said that how we die determines our next incarnation. That how we live will determine how we die. So if we are afraid of our life, we're going to be afraid of our death, which is going to pour into the karma of our next incarnation. So turn towards it. That's what I would say. It's here. It's always been here, though. It's just more pronounced right now. And I'll go down this vein of thought. I was hesitant for a second, but I'll let it happen. So one of the things that I learned through my shamanic work was I started connecting with the consciousness of the Lyme bacteria. So Lyme disease is caused by a bacteria. And I started to create an allyship with it.
That's phenomenal. That is phenomenal.
It was wild. I didn't do it intentionally.
No,
it wasn't through choice.
Let me just make friends with this whole thing living inside me.
But it made itself known that it was like, I'm here for a reason. Nothing in nature is displaced. It's only displaced relative to what humans think should be happening, right? We can see this in forest fires, for example. I live on the west coast of the US. Fire season is coming, and we think that fires are horrible, and they are relative to the human experience. They take homes and possessions and people's lives, and forest fires are necessary for the ecology. They are necessary for the environment. They clear the underbrush. They allow new life to emerge, right? And so again, the facets, turning the diamond, looking from a different perspective. And so I learned that through my experience with Lyme disease. And in December of 2020, Will and I contracted COVID. Now, it was a terrifying experience. I was already sick from mold. I was hit really hard. It was almost a month of recovery for me. And then I actually had long COVID for about 9 months where I couldn't breathe properly for almost 9 months. And in the experience of having COVID, I decided to turn towards it. And I could feel all of my fear, all of my own personal fear of my body's already weak. My body already is sensitive, and now I'm weakened from mold. And now I have this new pathogen that I'm fighting. And then there was the collective fear too. Right. Yeah. And so I felt all the layers of that, all the layers of the fear. And I decided to turn towards it. And what it brought me to was, and everyone's going to have their own experience of me sharing this. So to the listeners, if this doesn't resonate for you, you don't have to take this. This was just my experience, and I did find it helpful. Was when I turned towards the consciousness, the entity that is COVID, it revealed its teaching, which is to right our relationship with fear. And this was maybe like the 5th day of having it. So, for almost a month, every time I would feel fear, I would feel it welling up in my body. I would feel the stress response. And then I would meet myself and help myself settle, or let the fear just pass through me wholly and completely. And I think a lot of people are numb and shut down because of fear, just in general. I think it is one of the greatest sicknesses of humanity is we haven't learned how to be in right relationship with our fears. And so from the shamanic perspective, from my experience, I do believe that COVID is inviting us to right our relationship with fear, which always starts with turning towards it in the way that is available for you, the listener. Not saying you have to do it my way, not saying you have to go all the way in, but at least start getting curious about, what is my relationship with fear? And what is my relationship with death? Because it will inform a lot about how we be, how we live our lives, and how we can right our relationship to our own existence.
Thank you for sharing that. That's phenomenal. And I also really want to stress for our listeners that awareness that this is what you're doing, or just an awareness that we all have a relationship to death or to fear, is enough of a starting point. We don't need to jump off bridges into, creating some kind of, I need to turn into this kind. Just being aware of it and conscious that there is a relationship in existence there is something that I think we forget. We forget that we're always in relationship to things. And also, just to circle back on something you said about grief and the things you're allowed to have grief over and things you're kind of not in this society. A big part of the work that I've done with Will, like I had to step into the grief for the life that I didn't have, the life that I never got to even dream about, the life that I did have, like the reality that sucked. Like I had skipped grief for all of those things because I had to get on with things. I had just skipped grieving, and I didn't even realize I was allowed to be sad, because I have to be grateful. You have to be grateful, right? Don't you? You have to just be thankful that you got through it. And it's like, well, there's so many avenues that I didn't get to take. And I'm sure you feel the same. So many things that I'm never going to do, never going to be able to do, never going to have the opportunity for. And a lot of those required a necessary grieving process. And I think that the more we can honor the truth of how we feel, the more we are ourselves ultimately.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely relate on the grieving what never was, grieving what never will be. There are a couple of authors I'll offer to the listeners, Stephen Jenkinson, Francis Weller, and Stephen Levine. They all have great, just great perspective on things that are really hard to navigate. And I do encourage working with a therapist or a practitioner to have someone hold the container as you go into realms that, understandably so, it's hard. It's hard to be with. And I think that grief, ultimately, what these authors and my own experience of learning the death realms and the grief realms more intimately, is it never stops, in the sense that life is constantly changing, and we're going to feel loss, and we're going to feel sad about that. And it's okay to feel sad, right? There's nothing wrong with us because we're having an experience of sadness. Now, if it becomes prolonged and it manifests as depression, that's a different conversation, but we're riding the waves of life. Life is a cycle, and there are just times when we can even be really excited about one thing, but that inherently means we're letting something else go, whether that be an identity, whether that be a routine, whether that be a relationship or a business or what. And it's like, I would love to see a culture of allowing and inviting and encouraging people to grieve properly in the moment, so that it doesn't build up, right? And in that way, we're just clearer, more radiant vessels for our divinity.
Yeah. And I've said this so often about my work, about the fact that I have to see a coach myself. It's like, if I'd have done this at the time, like, I really resent having to do this right now, because I could have saved myself all of this. And I mean, I joke, and that's not necessarily true. And I always do. I think people underestimate how much we do need other people to do this stuff with. We're not saying go and sit in a room and cry on your own. We're saying be within grief or whatever the feeling is, and feel like you can be open about that too, and share and commune in an emotional state. And I think that's something that people forget. It's not like you have to sit in a darkened room and just be with your feelings.
No. In fact, that can cause more harm than good if not done artfully. There's definitely an art and a skill to that. So yeah, working with a practitioner, a somatic practitioner specifically, because they'll teach you how to move grief through your body. So that it's not just an intellectual swirling. I think that's where some people, even with the fear, the grief, it can all just kind of become this heady thing where we're trying to think our way through, but that's not how we process. We process through the body. So shameless plug for somatic.
I know, I was going to say, but to be honest, I'd endorse that and second it, all the things. So yes, just find someone who does somatic experiencing. But speaking of art and skill, and I mentioned it before about relating, what else are you doing in your world? Because I keep seeing on your Instagram this kind of notion of the relating and everything is a relationship and all of that. And I know you do so much more than just trauma and somatics, and you're a personal coach, but you're a huge champion of women and all the things. What else is in your world of practice, clinical practice, whatever you like to call it? What else do you do? Which is a terrible question, but feel free to take it in any direction you wish.
Yeah, absolutely. So my work is ever evolving. And like you said, all of life is a relationship. That's again, one of my core pillars for living a fluid, rhythmic, aligned life is that life is a dance. It's always relational. And I even feel that way in relationship to my business. And so my business is constantly changing, ever evolving. My offerings are very intuitively inspired and put out as they flow to me and through me. So right now, Will and I facilitate trauma and somatics. I facilitate monthly, give or take, monthly workshops. Last month's was called The Art of Relating, Deepening Your Intimacy with Life. So very much along the lines of a lot of what we've been talking about here. I've got a couple other signature workshops that I offer, Erotically Embodied. I offer a somatic rebirthing workshop. I do new moon circles every so often. So every month or so, if someone just kind of wants to drop in, get a feel for somatics, everything is somatic oriented, working with and through the body. And then I do private mentorship as well. So I mentor creatives, entrepreneurs, people who really want to pour their heart and soul into their life and design a life that works for them and lights them up. And then every so often I'll lead women's groups. So I have a women's group a group program called Sensuous that I lead once a year, give or take, feeling the pull to offer it in the fall. We'll see. Like I said, very fluid and intuitive. And then from there, it's just kind of as things arise. So I do birth doula work. I do death doula work. I'm an herbalist. I study astrology. And so I kind of weave that in as I'm inspired and as life kind of presents opportunities.
And did I see you were studying more of like midwife stuff? Are you doing more study in that area, or are you just researching what's that?
Yeah, so I've actually paused on that. I was all ready to click go and enroll in a midwifery program with an incredible elder named Wapio. But I've decided to push pause on that for the year ahead and focus more on astrology. But the midwifery stuff might come back around. It was one of when I wanted to be a doctor, I wanted to be an OBGYN. So birth and all things related to pregnancy and conception and conscious conception. I love all of that. So that might circle back around in the future.
And I'd just like to conclude all of our discussion today. You and I and everyone who gets to this place does a very good job of making it sound like we've all got our shit together. Because we know what we're talking about-ish conceptually. But I always like to ask the question of like, how are you now? Genuinely in your body, in your life, how would you say you are? How do you feel?
I love that you point towards this. Let's make it real. I mean, today I feel real good. I'm in my ovulation phase. It's sunny. Summer's here. Today is feeling really good. And overall, in kind of the container of my life, I definitely deal with highs and lows. I definitely have bad body days, as I call them, days where it's just really hard to be in my body, days where I hate my body, days where I don't want to do this, where I want to tap out. And then I have days like yesterday was just an incredible, singing and dancing and creating and playing. And I spent the afternoon in the river with my love. And so there's really incredible days where I am just so delighted to be a human. And then there are days where I want nothing but to tap out. And that's the real side of things. And day to day, moment to moment, things are different. And I've learned to ride the waves of life and meet them as they are, and be honest, and also stay tethered to gratitude and know that this is also changing and this too shall pass, and to really cultivate that, that Buddhist skill of non-attachment is definitely a high value of mine. And also just stay curious about things like, how interesting. Who is this one who doesn't want to exist anymore?
Yeah, no. The how interesting phrase is like the best phrase ever. It's like, well, that's interesting. So yeah, absolutely.
I today, from this position, I delight in the drama of the human experience. Ask me again in a couple of days, I might be in a different position.
Right. And thank you so much for sharing that with us and with our listeners, because I think it's always very necessary to give the real picture, particularly when we can be seen as authorities in this kind of realm of like, we've done it, and like, you've never done it. It's never over. It's always evolving. So
yeah. Thank you for that.
Is there anything else you would like to share with our listeners? Anything else you would like to say, comment on before we conclude today?
Just thank you. Thanks for inviting me here. Thanks for facilitating this conversation. Thank you to the listeners, to the community. And yeah, to kind of tie back in what you were just saying, like, it's never done. And humans are humans. And we're having worked with, probably, I don't know, 2,000 humans in the last 10 years or so, between workshops, teaching, retreats, things like that, private clients. It's the commonalities are more than the distinctions or the differences. Like, every human knows what it's like to be sad. Every human knows what it's like to be angry. Mm-hmm. Every human knows what it's, hopefully, I hope for every human to be loved, right? Mm. And to love. And it's like, no matter where you are on the path, like, some of us are more in one place than another. Maybe we're afraid of our anger, or we don't want to feel our sadness, or we only want to feel joy, or maybe joy and pleasure are hard to feel, right? Like, we all have our ways that we be in relationship with the human experience, and yet the human experience is still the human experience. So I think we're in a season of de-pedestalizing people and kind of doing away with the age of the guru and the one who knows all, and realizing that, we're all each other's teachers and we all have something to give.
Well, thank you for sharing your teaching and your wisdom with us today. I have deeply appreciated that. Listeners, I will tag everywhere you can find Aurianna, and all the things that we've mentioned today, I will put them all in the show notes. And so you can find all of the resources that you need. Thank you for spending the time.
Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Unveil Podcast. Please do remember that registration is now open for the Unveil Coach Training Certification course beginning in September of this year. If you are interested in becoming a coach, or as we like to call it, an integrative healing professional, then this is the course for you. A good bit of coach training mixed with human design and human physiology, and lots of information about being in business as a trauma-aware coach. All of the details can now be found at unveilacademy.com/launch.